mark your calendar if you haven't already. Okay. With that, if there's no other announcements, I'd like to introduce Vince Guerra, who will return and will introduce our speaker. Vince.
Norm? I have some prepared comments here about our speaker. He is no stranger to the North Shore, but is not a native. He's living here with his wife Chris on Locust Street in Danvers for only 43 years. Dr. Anthony Patton is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. He did 5 years of surgical training at the Mass General, with an extra year as a surgical registrar in England for famed surgeon Dr. Jack Griffith. Dr. Patton practiced as a thoracic and vascular surgeon on the North Shore in all the local hospitals, which included Salem, Union, and Beverly, I believe. But mainly at North Shore Medical Center, which is Salem Hospital. He was heavily involved in the teaching of surgical residents from Mass General who matriculated or circulated through Salem Hospital. He's presently the president-elect of the Boston Surgical Society. Since retirement, he has continued to teach at Harvard Medical School and has been on the board of a number of organizations, including the Danvers Historical Society. He is, in addition, a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He and his wife spend a considerable time at their home in Booth Bay, Maine, and are very active in the Booth Bay Region Land Trust. His favorite hobby is the writing of history, and tonight we'll discuss one of Danvers' finest people, Reverend Joseph Green. I might say that I've personally known Tony for over 20 years as a surgical consultant and colleague at Salem Hospital, which included a process of referral of patients from my former practice at Peabody Medical Associates. We also share monthly get-togethers in a retired physicians luncheon group in the North Shore area. So I introduce Dr. Patton, who will tell us about Joseph Green. Tony?
Thank you.
Great honor to be here again. I spoke here some 13 years ago about another doctor, Dr. Reverend. I don't know if any of you were here at that time. Can all of you hear me okay? I can use the mic. Okay. Yeah. Does that help? Does that help?
You hear all right?
Turn it on.
It's on. It's on.
Turn the volume on.
Yeah.
Right. Do you hear me all right now? Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Now, when we talk about the Salem witch trials, of course we think a lot of the beginnings, which were at Center Street, the first church in Danvers. But there was a huge spin-off, if you will, into the Topsfield area. And there have been very many explanations for the causes of the Massachusetts Bay witchcraft hysteria, and they're innumerable and often controversial. But the blunt reality is that some of the accusations then clearly were based on long-standing neighborhood and community disagreements and hatreds. I hate to be judgmental, but certainly the Putnams of Danvers, not all Putnams, but pretty much all of them, their assault on the town sisters of Topsfield, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Estes, and Sarah Cloyce, bordered on brutality. And only by luck did Sarah Cloyce escape hanging. The other two, of course, as you know, did not. And my story today is about Joseph Green, with the nastiness of bearing witness against old enemies for vengeful purposes must not be forgotten. And while I can suggest many references, Persis Macmillan's fine book, Currents of Malice, probably best describes this unpleasant side of the tragedy. Now, in the late 1690s, Salem Village and the surrounding areas were torn asunder in the aftermath of the witch trials. Famed historian Samuel Eliot Morison described the parish as impoverished by warfare with the invisible world, where men's garments were literally stained with each other's blood. The community boiled with hatred, and there seemed to be no hope. Now, in the midst of this cauldron, Reverend Joseph Green, just 22 years old, was called to lead the church in the community. And almost miraculously, Green changed the mood and direction of the village, and more than 200 years later, Morrison called him a hero. Now, in 1715, Green died a young man, hardly 40, and at his funeral, one eulogist said of his work, and I quote, "Salem Village had been broken into pieces with most unhappy divisions. But on the blessing of God attending Reverend Green's wise management, they were brought into a happy union, as most places among us, and they universally honored and reverenced him." As much as I am in awe, and I mean that, of Green's accomplishments, I am convinced, reading through his history and through the history of the time, including a lot of original papers, that Green was not totally unaware or unsupported in his work, thus not, as Machiavelli would call it, an unguarded prophet. Green had some knowledge of the local setting and issues here in this whole community, and his education had exposed him to open new ideas, championed by a strong liberal or progressive group within the Puritan hierarchy. Now, by his success, he not only skillfully healed the parish, but he also demonstrated to the Puritan society the practical value of the new, more inclusive and charitable spirit. Now, Green's predecessor, as you probably all know, was Reverend Samuel Parris, the central religious figure of the witchcraft delusion. The contrast in 1692, the contrast between the legacies of these two Puritan ministers less than 20 years apart is striking. Parris left alive, but in an atmosphere of defeat, failure, and strife, and Green left in death, but with traces of triumph, accomplishment, and peace. Now, the parish had had trouble with ministers for many years, as a lot of parishes did. But one reason for this was that the Massachusetts colony stipulated that everyone in the community was financially bound to support the minister in the church. But the requirements for membership in the church were very difficult, requiring a public declaration of faith or a covenant. And only a few in the community were able to do this. And at one time, for instance, in Salem Village, there were only 12 members of the church, 12 covenant members, but there were 50 other households that had to support the church. Resentment was often the result. Now, unfortunately as well, Reverend Parris was a very bad choice. He had a sense of aristocratic entitlement that irritated many in the community, and he also refused to accept new reforms for an open membership. He was already in trouble before the witch hysteria in 1692. At the time of that crisis, he managed to make matters much worse. His response to the young women's hysteria was not measured and calm, but he frightened and provoked the parish with inflammatory sermons. And then he began to give depositions and accusations against people in his own community, including Rebecca Nurse. He even excommunicated one of his own parish, Martha Corey. And he spoke out against people who refused to support him. Often these people he spoke out against were people whose loved ones he had sent to prison or to the gallows. And he continued his railings throughout the 90s, well after the trouble had stopped. In 1696, 4 years after the Troubles, a group of prominent ministers recommended that he leave Salem Village, but he stayed, pouting about his lack of support. Now, most of the community felt that they could not uphold their legal obligation to support Parris because their conscience would not allow them to give to one who would send their relatives and neighbors to the gallows. Others, often covenant members of the church and past accusers of witches, tended to support Barras. In the summer of 1697, a petition or declaration about the conflict was sent for arbitration or consideration by a committee of distinguished Boston people. This unusually sophisticated document was written by two relatives of Rebecca Nurse, John Turnbell and Samuel Nurse, the son, and an accused witch, Daniel Andrews, who lived right up here in Putnam Street, Locust Street, and who escaped to avoid trial, and Joseph Putnam, who, in contrast to most of the rest of the Putnam family, had vehemently opposed the proceedings from the very beginning. Now, in addition to stating that Paris was guilty of perjury, the document also attacked Paris's defense of so-called spectral evidence. It supported the idea that the afflicted children were possessed by the devil, and not those falsely named as witches. It was, by implication, an important grievance against the covenant members of the church, suggesting they and Paris had actively promoted the witch hunt, and thus caused the deaths of innocent people. Now, young Reverend Green, just 22 years old, as I mentioned, had to deal with this serious charge when he took over the parish, really a year later. In 1697, Paris finally left, accepting a financial statement, but he left the community divided and in a spiritual vacuum. Now, it might seem to the rest of us in this day and age that this Puritan church in Salem Village had had its fill of ministers, but their commitment to maintaining a functional parish demanded that they quickly find another spiritual leader. Some reluctant candidates were invited to preach in the fall of 1697, and indeed Joseph Capen came over. But most were understandably fearful of the position. And about this time, the parish heard of a new name, Joseph Green. Now, Joseph was born on November 24th, 1675, in Cambridge, the 8th son of John Green, a tailor, likely a clothier. Brooks Brothers, I don't think, but he was named a clothier. He had 10 brothers and 4 sisters, and Joseph was chosen to be the scholar and hopefully the minister in the family. In his early teens, he entered Cambridge Latin School, which was there when the descendant of that was there when I went to high school. And Green commented later on his youth in his own moral character, saying, quote, "I was an untoward and corrupt child, yet God blessed me with a good memory, so my parents urged me to be a scholar." His primary teacher there was Reverend Nathaniel Walter, a kindly man who he was to meet later. As expected of a potential Puritan scholar, in 1691, Green entered Harvard, the only college in the colony, and successfully graduated in 1695. The experience at Harvard was to influence Green's life profoundly. Soon after he started classes, his father died, and young Green would not have been able to continue without help. Thankfully, direct financial aid came from William Brattle, Thomas Brattle, and their brothers, as well as John Leverett. The dominant mind at Cambridge at that time was William Brattle. He had written a new book on logic based on recent philosophy that was read by all the students. William's brother, Thomas Brattle, had become a successful merchant and later was treasurer of Harvard. Thomas and William had helped originate the Brattle Street Church in Boston, which was a haven for those with liberal ideas about church membership. The Brattles believed that people had the right to, quote, interpret the scriptures for themselves instead of being obliged to subscribe to the beliefs of the Puritan Church. This in itself was a radical idea indeed. And William Brattle as well had a strong reputation as a dedicated teacher and a friend to the students. During the smallpox epidemic at Harvard, he bravely stayed with the students and contracted the dreaded disease himself. By this and other charitable acts, he was known as the father of Harvard. In 1692, at the time of the witchcraft hysteria, Thomas Brattle, in the midst of it, wrote a scathing and important criticism of the event. Brattle's letter boldly laid blame for the whole tragedy on the local ministers, including our own Samuel Parris, Salem's Nicholas Noyes, and Beverly's John Hale. Now, another liberal tutor and financial supporter of Green at Harvard was John Leverett. He was a layman. In the early 1700s, Leverett became the first layman to be elected president of Harvard. Leverett supported the movement to open college education to others, to those others than candidates for the ministry, an idea vital to the rising influence of the wealthy middle class. Perhaps the most important part of any, mine, yours, undergraduate education is the exposure and philosophy to the ideas of one's classmates. Now, in Green's class at Harvard, there were only 22 young men, and they knew each other very well. One classmate was Oliver Noyes, who was a strong supporter of economic reform and a new entrepreneurial spirit. He was intensely disliked by some conservative Puritans such as Cotton Mather. Another classmate was Timothy Lindell, related to the prominent and wealthy people in Salem who were heavily involved in the witch tragedy and vehemently opposed the proceedings. Green knew his classmates well and must have been influenced by their ideas. Another classmate, Thomas Blowers, also a protege of William Brattle, took over Reverend Hale's parish in Beverly and became Green's closest friend for life. Now, in 1695, Green graduated from Harvard. In the same year, he assumed the position of the master of Roxbury Latin School, a prestigious school then as now. And at that time, he experienced a spiritual awakening, partly due to the influence of his old high school teacher, Reverend Nathaniel Walker, and decided to become a minister. He confessed that his previous life had been sinful, and that he had spent too much time in, quote, fowling and fishing and dancing and foolishness. Sounds pretty good to me. Joseph Green took his new calling seriously and began to preach at Walter's nearby church. His fine sermons attracted attention. So in the fall of 1697, Deacon Edward Putnam of the Salem Village Church traveled the 20 rough miles to listen to young Green and liked what he heard. Green was asked to preach here in Danvers, of course, I'm saying, at the first church, and soon was asked to settle there permanently. He looked upon this invitation with great misgiving, but after the consultation with his respected and trusted old Harvard friend and tutor, William Brattle, Green accepted the post. Now, Green's conditions to his new parish were, quote, that they must continue in love, and if they begin to quarrel and contend, I should look upon myself to be free from any obligation to tarry with them. Green was blessed with an optimistic, cheerful, and confident nature, and he went to work immediately to deal with the spiritual sickness of his flock. Even before his ordination, he addressed the outstanding 1697 petition that I mentioned by Daniel Andrews and the relatives of Rebecca Nurse against Paris and other members of the church, which accused him of complicity in the death and suffering of many innocent people. He handled this thorny issue at age 22 by having the church membership agree to a confession in their involvement in the whole sad episode. One can envision the scene with Green, who just arrived, barely shaving, whatever they did in those days, first suggested the idea of confession to the church members. But they accepted the proposal, and he read the confession in the meeting house, and only one refused to comply. Green described the results in his commonplace book. Quote, "Whereupon Mr. Andrews stood up, and after some discourse, I desired him to say whether he was satisfied or not. And he said that he was satisfied with them as a church, and prayed God to bless them." The healing had begun. On November 10th, 1698, Green was ordained into his new church. The Reverend John Hale Beverly installed the young minister, and friends and religious leaders from near and far attended, and they all participated in the laying on of hands to legitimize his new office and title. Within a few weeks, Green followed up on his crusade to heal past wounds and welcomed the return to the village church of several members who were against Paris and who had not attended for years. Then in the spring of 1699, Green took even more drastic action. It boldly arranged the seating in the pews so that those who had accused others of witchcraft were seated with the families of those they had accused. Several of Rebecca Nurse and the town sister's relatives were seated next to the Putnams and others who had accused their wives, aunts, and in-laws of witchcraft and sent them to the gallows. The assignment of pews was a serious issue under any circumstances, and the changes were not taken lightly. The tension between these estranged families during Sunday services must have been palpable, but the new arrangement seemed to accomplish its purpose. Peace was restored. That same winter, 1699, Green courted Elizabeth Garish of Wenham and married her in March. They were described as an ideal couple, and they were blessed with 8 children. Green began to work on other important issues. First, he persuaded the church to accept the so-called halfway covenant, which granted church membership to the baptized children of those who had made the full open declaration in the past. Another reform allowed members to declare their faith to the minister in private, rather than by tedious and unnerving public declaration. As a result, more church members were brought into the fold, and this in turn created stronger and broader support from the community. There was little validity left in the argument of taxation of many for the benefit of a few. In another brave stroke for reconciliation, in 1703, Green's urging, the parish dramatically voted to rescind the excommunication of Montfort. Many in the church had testified against her. Described as an outspoken person, she was also a convenient target of persecution because she had given birth to a mulatto child out of wedlock some years before. By 1703, Green actively lent support to a petition to the Massachusetts General Court by 12 ministers of Essex County, including Reverend as well, that some of the accused and convicted witches be cleared of any crime. As a result, the court declared the proceedings in 1692 unlawful because of, quote, weak evidence. Perhaps the most dramatic catharsis of the witchcraft episode occurred in August of 1706. 14 years before, Ann Putnam, the daughter of Thomas Putnam Jr. and Ann Carr Putnam, had one of the most vehement crime accusers as a child. She was now 26 years of age, and the tragic results of her testimony weighed heavily on her conscience. Her minister helped her to relieve her distress. Ann Putnam's confession was read before the congregation by Reverend Joseph Green, and one suspects his hand in the language of the writing. It read, "I desire to be humbled before God. For that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in year about 92, that I, then being in my childhood, should by such a providence of God be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, and whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe that they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I justly fear I have been instrumental with others through ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself and this land the guilt of innocent blood. So what was said and done by me against any person, I can truly and uprightly say, before God and man, I did it not out of anger, malice, or ill will to any person, for I had no such thing against one of them. But what I did was ignorantly done, being deluded by Satan. And particularly, I was a chief instrument of accusing of good wife, nurse, and her 2 sisters. And I declare to lie in the dust and be humble, for in that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity to them and their families, which cause I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness of God. And from all those whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, whose relations were taken away or accused. Ian Putnam acknowledged that this was her statement. And Dr. Green, that they gave her communion. Sorry, I get a little upset about this particular thing, because it's such an emotional thing. Now, Ann Putnam was the first accuser to confess, and her statement was perhaps the most poignant. Resentment against her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., and her father, Thomas Putnam Jr., was intense. Ann's statement that summer day in 1706 proved the soundness of Green's basic strategy to encourage confession and to offer forgiveness. But the belief in witchcraft died slowly. On several occasions, Reverend Green felt obliged to preach against divination or the use of the occult to predict the outcome of future events. One of Green's early biographers suggested that Green even used exorcism in the treatment of a parishioner, Mrs. John Dale, because of what Green described as, quote, a disturbance related to satanic influence. One wonders what that was. Consistent with the Puritan belief in education, Green soon gained approval for a new schoolhouse, arguably the first in the village. And his diary indicates that he may have built much of it himself. And he also gave huge sums, relatively large sums, for the building of a new meeting house. Green encouraged charitable donations to the poor, lent money to parishioners in fiscal trouble, and often trekked off to Middleton, what was called Will's Hills in those days, to care for the sick. Once he helped defend Haverhill against attacks from our Native Americans, who throughout the 17th century were desperately trying to hold on. In one amusing passage, Green talks of the benefits of recreation, particularly if it, quotes, quicken you to your duty. He was quite proud of his skill as a hunter. He claimed to have killed 18 pigeons with one shot. I suspect the translation meant one shooting, but in the commonplace book that he wrote, it said one shot. Others said that Green killed a wildcat and a wolf, and he worked hard on his farm, and in one season stored as many as 40 barrels of cider, one suspects hard cider, in his cellar. Preaching to others is probably easier if you share both their problems and their pleasures. Now, although Green totally changed the spirit of the village, his ideology was still very much pure, and he never espoused a revolution. Despite his orthodox beliefs, Green emphasized in his writings each individual's chance for redemption and salvation. However, I suspect most of us would find him somewhat moralistic. Frequently, in his writings, Green quoted from letters that he sent to his relatives. One wonders if his mother must have been surprised to receive harsh advice from her son. And I quote, "I commend serious meditation to you, mother, as of being of excellent advantage. And I pray you often to think of heaven and eternal glory. And I pray to be often looking at the estate of your soul." Perhaps only a Puritan minister would challenge his mother about the estate of her soul. Green's best friend and classmate, Thomas Flowers, arrived on the North Shore in 1701 and took over as minister at the Beverly Church. He faced many of the large church right in the middle of town, by the way. He faced many of the same controversial problems. Green mentioned some of Flowers' early troubles in his diary. Quote, "I went with my wife to Mr. Flowers' ordination, and after some debate, there was a happy peace agreed upon, and we proceeded with comfort to universal satisfaction. The stormy weather was emblematic of the affairs of the day. I don't know what the point of controversy was that day, and it was not described, but whatever the trouble, was probably about the opening of the church membership and the halfway covenant. Green mused that he may have been too vocal. I quote, "I have reason to be humbled for my heat of spirit and hot talk in managing the affair." Green mentions Flowers frequently in his diary. They often took walks together and discussed common problems. There were charming descriptions of Flowers praying for rain in a drought, and later trying to abate a plague of worms in the Beverly community. One is the medical origin of a plague of worms in the Beverly community. By 1715, the ravages of consumption of tuberculosis had weakened Green. He mentioned many times in his diary that he was not well, but each week bravely tried to deliver the Sunday sermon. Finally, too weak to carry on his duty, on November 26, 1715, Reverend Joseph Green of Salem Village died at the age of 40. One story describes his dying after giving a rousing Sunday sermon. Deacon Edward Putnam, some 23 years ago, had supported the witch trials, wrote in the church record, and I quote, "Then was the choicest flower and greenest olive tree in the garden of our Lord here cut down. In his prime, then did that bright star set, and nevermore to appear here among us. Then did our sun go down, and now what darkness is come upon us." Everyone in the region came to Green's funeral service as if he were a saint. By some accounts, most wept, and some kissed his coffin in an uncharacteristically emotional tribute. The remarks of many ministers were published so that Green's memory would be everlasting. Reverend Joseph Green extolled Green's accomplishments. Reverend Joseph Capen, extolled Green's accomplishments. Perhaps Flowers' oration was the most effusive. It referred often to their close friendship. Of these men of the cloth present on that day, only Nicholas Noyes of Salem had supported the witchcraft delusion. His tone was now quite different, and his poetic praise for Green was emotional and heart-rendering, if not Shakespearean. His poem went like this: "For like that blessed bird, he still green olive leaves brought in his bill. He dried up the floods of strife, and he bade brethren dwell in unity." Or later, "Under this sorry heap of stones, rich treasure lies, dear Joseph's bones. From Salem village, Christ will move them to a Salem that's above, when the last trumpet gives its sound, and the saints will start from underground, be changed, and mount with one accord to meet with their descending Lord." Now, Samuel Early Morrison was to write some years later, "Joseph Green was truly a minister hero, a healer among men, a leader of a new era of tolerance and compassion." Now, Green's widow, Elizabeth Garish Green, is now alone with young children, probably without too much in the way of financial support. Within a year, she married again, this time to an older man of great means. How appropriate it was that William Brattle, now a widower, would marry. Green Stevens' widow. I suspect Joseph would have been very happy to know his old mentor and friend, the inspiration of the liberal movement, was there to support him even after death. Thank you.
Address to Dr. Patton?
Yes.
Does Reverend Capen's remarks, do they survive?
Yes, they're in the Mass Historic Society. How is it described? It's a whole bunch of, a lot of the eulogies at his Green's funeral were kept. And it was published in a book by, interestingly enough, the publisher's name was Green, and it was published mainly under the impetus or the support, financial support of Reverend Garish, widow, who was his father-in-law. His wife was Garish.
Yeah, we have very few copies of anything that Capen never published.
Yes, well, this
We do have a copy of that petition. that he signed.
I don't have a copy of this. It's a real volume, but I'll give it a go and see if I can find it. See if because it was. He also gave lengthy sermons to the Danvers or Salem Village Church about Green and about how important it was to have a minister. Which is a little self-serving, but it's very long, incredibly long. So you don't have much in terms of his writings. That's very interesting. Well, these are very insightful. Yes.
Did this spirit of tolerance eventually spread, from this region further west and south among the Puritans?
This spirit of green, of tolerance.
Yes, tolerance.
Yeah. Well, of course, these things come in fits and starts, but there was a change. There was no question about it. There was a time of change, of allowing more people to be educated, of allowing more people to be members of the church, of toleration, relative toleration of other religions. Although, it took, when Harvard hired a Jewish man to become the professor of Hebrew, he had to change his religion. and so you have to be very careful about how tolerant they were. But there was no question about the whole, at least in New England, everything sort of changed. It was, after all, a lot of great entrepreneurial spirit in the main settlers already. So a lot of New Hampshire settlers around Portsmouth, which was very active. And that influence was seeping in, as well as the fact of the whole seacoast, particularly at Salem and Boston. A lot of travelers coming back with new ideas from Holland, particularly, were very prominent at that time. The very famous doctor at that time, of course, it was Boerhaave in Holland. His influence in openness and science and everything just spread. That kind of idea, and the new philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, etc., all this stuff made a difference. It slowly changed the society. It's interesting in terms of that toleration. When Harvard Medical School was formed in 1782, the three professors who formed the faculty had to sign a declaration that they were Protestants. But in all fairness to them, none of them would sign it. So there was. So even though there was there was always this yin and yang, if you will, of the society.
What about Quakers or within your?
Yes, the Quakers, of course, mainly came, as all of you know, to New Jersey with William Penn. But there were a number of Quakers who lived in this area, and they were considered on the outs from the church. The church wasn't happy with it, particularly Cotton Mather, and his father.
Yeah, was the Puritan Church
an organized Puritan church, or it would just characterize all the parishes here as Puritan in some form?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. The way they set it up was that indeed it was an overall, it was thought to be a theocracy, if you will. Each parish had and this was the seeds of democracy in a sense, would choose their own minister and would have the right to vote if they became members. And everyone, for instance, in Topsfield, all of you here would be, by law, had to support the parish church, and you were supposed to go. But only a few were members because they had made this large covenant. They had to get up in church and say why they believed in God and the Trinity and so forth. And this was it was a difficult covenant to make. So there was a conflict between those people paying money and those people who were the members. But the overall riding thing was by a group of ministers that controlled Harvard and included people like Cotton Mather, John Cotton before, and other people like that. They set up a overriding method of control called the Cambridge Platform, which was the overall sort of rules that you were supposed to have for the society.
Besides the requirement to support the parish church, was there any other choice? Was there, besides the requirement to support the parish church, was there any other choice? Was there an Episcopal presidency?
I know there was, but how I was saying that, one of the things that had happened at about this time, in 1692, just quite a few years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up, there was a large element of tolerance for particularly for the Episcopal Church, and indeed one was built in Salem of let's see, right at the, I forgot the name of it, I apologize. It's a large stone church at the very near, let's see, where's it near? It's near where the restaurant, what's the name of the restaurant? No, what's the name of the restaurant that we go to here?
Lyceum?
The Lyceum, yeah, it's very near, it's just up the street from us. And that, there were Episcopalians, and indeed they were, most Episcopalians were loyalists around here. However, there were a good number of them in New Hampshire that weren't loyalists. But that had begun, and there were ministers like Brattle and like Samuel Willett, a very important figure at the time of the witchcraft trials, who was for more toleration. There was no question about it.
Most government officials were Episcopalian.
Well, that was a conflict too, because during the Cromwellian times, the Puritans here were pretty well allowed to control everything, and there were very little influence of the crown, because Charles had been beheaded, of course, and when Charles II came afterwards, he demanded loyalty to him, but they still didn't interfere much with the Puritan theocracy here until 1690, 1692. And that was, some people feel that was one of the causes of the unrest in the community, and some of the causes why people began to believe that these children, their outcries, that they really were witches that were destroying society. And of course it was good for the people like Cotton Mather and other people like that to acknowledge that there might be witches, because their whole theology depended upon this frightening hell and the idea of predestination. So having found the witches in the community justified, if you will, their religion and their approach. Yes.
Did Reverend Green not believe in predestination?
Did Reverend Green what?
Not believe in predestination?
Oh, that's a very interesting thing. Most of his writings were a long book called a commonplace book that was only found in 1920 in an English store, bookstore. And then his diary, of course. His diary was a little more about his regular life. And the commonplace book, he would have long writings about his philosophy, which are very interesting. And there's very little about predestination. There's very little about that. It was always that people could save their own souls. He believed in original sin, however. I'm totally outside of my field now, but I have two daughters who are professors of religion, and they explain these things to me. But the predestination thing was always a tough area to understand, because even though in this group, there's supposed to be some of those predestined, we're not supposed to know who they are, but by their actions and by their holiness, one suspected who they were. So it gets very, very, very iffy. I'm sure you know all about this. But as far as I can tell, if he didn't believe in predestination, and I'm sure he had heard about it, he didn't mention it much. But he believed in the original sin about how if you don't go to church and pray and so forth, that you would spend the rest of your life, when you die, you go to hell.
But wasn't that, the whole tenet was by grace only are you saved?
Excuse me?
By grace only are you saved?
Yeah.
Not by,
Well, he believed that there was an active, that you were Green himself believed, but I think the Puritans, you know, again, I'm way out of line here. I don't really understand all this, but my understanding was exactly what you said, by grace that you were saved. You're right. Yes.
two questions. One is, was it these 15 members of the church that called Green
Yes.
and got rid of Parish?
Yes, well.
Paris. And the second one is, I think you're making the Puritan religion way too hierarchical than it actually was. And that the Cambridge platform was a voluntary meeting
Yes.
of the ministers to decide what things can they agree on.
Yes, that's right.
And it had no, other than, oh, yes, that sounds like a good idea. It had absolutely no formal or informal requirements
Right.
or authority over any of the individual churches. And each church
Right.
was completely separated, and they only got together for, support.
Right. That's true. However, the ministers did, I don't want to get into a polemic about this, but, and I agree with you 100%. Your point is very well known. However, having said that, there was a uniformity of what people thought at the time, and each church and each people tended to believe the same Puritan doctrine.
No, it wasn't. It was a great deal. And that's one reason the George Borrows got into so much trouble.
Yes, that's why you got hanged. But I think
And one reason why when Parrish came from the West Indies, the people who went to the church in Salem Village were from the beginning very upset with him because they did not agree with what he was trying to teach them.
yes, right. No, I think you're, I think you're absolutely right.
So anyway, who voted Green in?
Excuse me?
Who voted Green in?
I'm sorry.
Who voted Green in to be the minister at the Salem Village Green in?
Oh, the membership.
So the 15 people who,
Yes.
I mean, to me, that would sound like they're ready for reconciliation anyway, if they vote Green in to be their minister.
Right. Maybe right. You're ready for it. You're probably very ready. Things have to go both ways. I agree. Yes.
Where are the documents, the diary and the common?
Place book. Yeah, you can
Where are
find
they
a
now?
copy of the Commonplace book at the Mass Historical Society. I think there's one also for Margaret, a copy of it. And his diary is has been translated, excuse me, it's hard to read, but it's translated at the Phillips Library.
Oh.
So, Yes.
Did anybody see any paradox or irony in the fact that the girl could confess that she was under Satan's spell and all was forgiven, and yet the others who were under Satan's spell were angered?
Well, now, this is a very important point, and you all obviously know much more about this than I do, but my understanding of this is intense, and I've written a lot about this. There was a difference between being possessed and afflicted. In other words, if you were afflicted by a witch, someone else, this was okay. But if you were someone who was possessed and were a witch, then that meant an unclean soul. And this was a very important difference, so that originally, when the children began to cry out and so forth, the best thing for them to say was that they were afflicted by a witch. It was not their fault. And then they weren't possessed by the devil. But just as soon as this began to get going, people like Samuel Willard and other ministers were suspicious of this whole stuff at the beginning. And it actually dealt with a child 20 years before it brought, named Elizabeth Knapp. And he decided that this girl that he had dealt with and brought 20 years before was possessed rather than afflicted by a witch, by someone else. But he didn't make that statement so badly to terrorize her. He created conflict. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to present you with a little token of our appreciation.
This is being retired. I hope it's cash. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, if you want it. It's part of a memento from the historical society.
Oh, wow.
It is a memento.